Hello, everyone, and welcome to our session today, which is entitled Managing Stress. This is a 40-minute podcast. My name is Martin McGuinness. I'm part of the delivery team at Full Circle Management Solutions, the company that's been commissioned to deliver on behalf of the council. Today's session, as I say, will last about 40 minutes. It will focus primarily on all issues regarding stress, in particular stress in the workplace. So we'll be looking in depth at what causes stress. We'll also look at tips and techniques by way of handling stress. And we'll look at the signs and symptoms of how to recognize potential stress or challenges around stress within other people, particularly our colleagues at work. So I'm just going to share the screen here now by way of pulling up the presentation, which will be accessible to you as we work through the session. You can request slides in your own format if you require. Okay, so as I say, stress at work, one of the big things that I suppose is worth thinking about before we start would be, what does stress mean to you? And one of the things we're going to talk about would be the difference between pressure and stress. I personally have my own view on that, which I'll share with you in a while. And what I mean by that is I'll share some anecdotal examples as we work through this presentation of how I perhaps have moved from what I would describe as pressure to feeling stress and the impact that that's had on me personally over the years. So, as I say, my name's Martin McGuinness. I've been working with small businesses probably for around about 25 years now. And I suppose one of the things that I've learned would be that in dealing with managers and owner managers of small businesses, I've learned to realize that people deal and cope with stress in many, many different ways. Some people would, I suppose, see themselves as coping with stress effectively, others perhaps not so effectively. And as we find ourselves in these challenging times, particularly with regard to the coronavirus, one of the things that many people are talking about would be resilience. I would just say to you that in case there is any confusion around resilience and what resilience means, it's not perseverance. It's not about keeping going, although that's naturally an attribute that many see as positive. Resilience is more about how you respond, how you recover. It's about bounce back ability, getting back on the horse, back on your feet after you've received a knock. And managing stress and pressure sits very much in the heart of what it means to be resilient. How can you cope? How can you deal with the challenges that you face day and daily? So what we'll cover in today's session will be a bit of an acknowledgement about where we find ourselves today. And as I talk to you, we are in, I suppose, the very center or right in the eye of the needle when it comes to the issues that the coronavirus is causing us at this moment in time. As I've hinted at, we'll talk about what it means to understand stress and how that sits in and around like the business and why it would be important to consider good mental health from a business perspective. We'll also talk about staying well and managing stress and the choices that we have and the choices, I suppose, that we don't have. We'll think about the signs and symptoms and we'll talk about early intervention. How can you recognize those signs and symptoms in other people? How can we stay well and support each other? And how can we make sure that we put an action plan together to make sure that we see some sort of improvement or forward planning? So I suppose we would all see ourselves at some point is dealing with or coping with a stressful lifestyle. And that, for most of us, would be defined in different ways. The business case is very forthright and very straightforward when it comes to statistics or information. In fact, I could blind you with information and statistics about stress at work, but let's just look at the key highlights. We do know, this is back in 2016, we do know that the way we work now, this sedentary lifestyle that we talk about, we lose about 24 days per year, each worker in the UK. We lose about 24 days per year in productivity, which is sizable. Interestingly, there's a lot of talk about how stress impacts on the work culture. And even back in 2010, some of the headlines that you would have read at that time would have been describing stress as the asbestos of the future. So we're very, very aware of it, both on a personal basis and also in a work context. Those statistics that you can see on screen, I'm going to leave you to read for yourself. However, as I said, they're quite compelling, quite forthright. So, what's the difference between pressure and stress? It's an interesting topic. I, for one, would have, I suppose, recognized over the years that, and I would have verbalized this when I was younger, that I need pressure in order to get things done, in order to be effective. And that's quite interesting from the point of view of, how you perceive what it is you need in order to be effective. It's probably fair to say that most people recognize pressure when pressure builds. But where's the line between pressure and stress? Is there a line? Well, here's some definitions around mental health. And again, have a look at those. Just familiarize yourself with those definitions. And you'll see at the bottom of that slide, highlighted in red, that as defined by the Health and Safety Executive, an adverse reaction is where excessive pressure or other types of demand are placed on work, and stress there can be a significant cause of illness. I just want to talk a wee bit from a personal perspective about my relationship with stress and my understanding of the difference between pressure and stress. As a young manager in my 20s, I would have prided myself on my ability to get things done, to be effective. I was, in many respects, the go-to person in the office if you wanted something done and you want it done quickly. I would have said that I would have been that person who would have always followed through and met deadlines, etc., etc. And I needed that pressure. I thrived on that pressure. After a number of years, however, probably unknown to me, I started to struggle. The work pressure was starting to build. It was becoming excessive. I was finding that I was doing more and more overtime. I was doing more and more work outside of the 9 to 5. So weekends became a regular thing. It nearly became the norm. And whilst I was, in my mind, handling that pressure, I was aware that it was becoming excessive. And I did question at times whether it was sustainable. However, it was a needs must situation, and I took it, I suppose, what I would have said at that time, in my stride. One year coming up to Christmas, the pressure was becoming what I would maybe look back on as nearly unbearable. And I found myself in a situation coming into Christmas where I was really struggling to get things completed, to get things done. And what happened after the Christmas holidays is something that really had an impact on me because I found myself coming into the office on Boxing Day, um, and it was a bit of an outer body, I would describe as an outer body experience. I didn't really think about what it was that I was doing until I got to the office. And when I got to the office, it was nearly like I came to. It was like I woke up, realized that I was in the office, realized it was Boxing Day, and started to question what it was I was doing. However, one of the things that I realized that particular day was that when I did have a look at what it was I was doing, I realized that I had probably about 13 or 14 key activities or projects, as I would have described them then, that I was working on. And the thing that I noticed most of all was that all of those projects were started, they were open, but none of them, not one of them, was in anywhere near completion. None of them were even close to being completed. And I did recognize that at that point in time, I was coping by starting projects, but for whatever reason, not having the ability to finish them. What happened after the Christmas holidays moved to a completely different level. And what I found was that um, I was having difficulty actually going to work, getting my head off the pillow each morning to get up, get showered, and get ready to go to work. And eventually, after a few weeks, I couldn't actually get out of bed to go to work. And it was at that point that I realized that things had moved to a much serious level, much more serious level. But that's the first time that I really encountered the experience of moving from what I would describe as pressure to stress, that line. And I suppose the line for me, and as defined here, is that it started to have a significant impact on my health. In fact, I was ill. Whereas the pressure that I'd been dealing with up to that point, there was no issue around illness. There was no issue around um, me feeling any form of illness. Whereas after Christmas, it was a completely different situation. So it's interesting just to think about that. And in psychological terms, when we when we experience that heightened emotion, when the pressure becomes excessive, we do learn an awful lot about our ability to cope. And we use the term "in the grip." In the grip is when things become really heightened and when the pressure becomes quite extreme and it takes us outside of our comfort zone. And it's worth thinking about that in terms of where you are yourself today in relation to these heightened periods of pressure. And when the emotion becomes heightened, how do you respond? Do you kick out? Or can you manage those emotions? Can you regulate those emotions? We all know what it's like to speak to someone in anger. Um, and it's just worth thinking about that as we go through our presentation today. Anxiety is our body's response to perceived or real threat. And we talk about fight or flight. I think most of us have heard of that definition. That's our way of getting ready. Walking down a dark alleyway, perceiving danger around the corner is natural. We've all, I think, experienced that at some stage. That getting ready, that state of alertness, dealing with a potential threat or danger, and feeling vulnerable. We call that the emotional brain. And the emotional brain is what you will experience first. The feelings and the emotions are what you will experience first in a fight or flight situation. So you'll feel that anxiety, you might feel the heartbeat, increased heartbeat, you'll feel the adrenaline, but whatever it is you feel, you will feel it first. And it's only afterwards that the thinking brain, as we call it, actually kicks in, the rational brain. So it's a bit like a car accident where someone realizes that they perhaps were nearly killed, they were in threat, their life was in threat, and they will feel that adrenaline rush, they will feel that increased heartbeat, etc., etc. And afterwards, when that pale face, that red eye shock kicks in, that I think we've all experienced or seen, that's really a sign that the thinking brain is catching up, the rational brain is catching up, the realization that this was very close to a fatal or catastrophic situation. So the emotional brain will always come first, followed by the thinking brain. And it's recognizing that feelings and emotions can become very heightened in a pressurized situation and how we deal with that. We're going to look at that as part of this presentation today. When we think about stress, it's also worth considering that it's not just about mental health. And in particular, where we find ourselves today with this crisis that we're in, it's worth considering how not just mental health can be impacted, but also a range of other aspects of well-being. So we've talked a bit about emotion. We're all certainly very aware of the financial impact and how our financial well-being is being impacted by this crisis. There's a lot of talk about physical well-being and how people are starting to maybe try to get together some routine with regard to their physical health. Even though they may not be able to attend the gym, people are starting to do things at home, etc., etc. Socially, we're being cut off. What impact is that having on your well-being? Intellectually, we're having to work differently. We're having to use possibly new technology. We're having to work from home. We're having to communicate in a different way. We're having to maybe work outside of our comfort zone. And occupationally, obviously, we are working perhaps, if we are lucky to be working, in a completely different way. So it's worth thinking about where you are with your own mental health, your own well-being in general, um, across these key areas. And one of the things that you might want to do after this session is just take 5 minutes and literally grade yourself in each of these areas so that you can get a sense of where your priorities lie in terms of your current well-being. Where is it that you need to pay most attention to? Where is it that you're coping well? Where is it that perhaps you're not coping so well? It's a worthwhile exercise just to take some time after the session, if you can, to have a look at this. One thing that's also worth considering is what is it that you and how is it that you are spending your time? And are you being effective in the use of that time? There's a term called helplessness, which is very much related to stress. Helplessness is where people get to a point where I suppose they are just not coping and things just start to get worse, they start to unravel. And it's a bit like going into your bank account, into your overdraft, um, whereby maybe you've spent to the limit. Well, if I've spent to the limit, what's an extra 20 or 30 or £100 on top of that limit? What difference is that going to make? In for a penny, in for a pound, that type of approach. So helplessness is that sort of drowning, getting worse, not getting any better, not coping, etc., etc. Um, and when we talk about that, it's worth thinking about exactly what it is you should be concerned about at this time, and what is it you can actually influence. We spend a lot of time concerning ourselves about things that perhaps we cannot influence. We cannot stop the coronavirus. We can certainly do things by way of protecting ourselves, but in the wider picture, the coronavirus is here and we have to deal with it. Can we influence certain aspects of this crisis? Of course we can. We can get help from other people. We can take the advice that's been given to us in terms of day to day living. But there are certain things that we cannot influence. The bigger picture, the impact on the economy, on our businesses. Yes, we can certainly um, influence certain aspects of that, but in a wider perspective, should we be getting concerned about the big picture stuff? And that's a question that is probably quite controversial in terms of the answer to that question, but again, is worth considering. Where are you spending your time? And are you, or is it, a good use of your time when you consider what it is you're trying to influence and what it is you're showing concern about? In times of crisis, we are starting to use terms around effectiveness and efficiency. And in times of crisis, speed is your friend and accuracy is your enemy. And let's just consider that for a minute. In psychological terms, we call that speed, that effectiveness. We term that red energy. In other words, doing things right, prioritizing, getting the most important things out of the way, getting those things done. And for those people that perhaps focus on what we call blue energy, where if we think about the perfectionist, if we think about the analytical type of person who likes to do things right, that person at this moment in time may struggle. They may find that this particular time is quite difficult, because we know that in times of crisis, it is very much about reaction and perhaps not so much about the detail. And that's something that's worth considering as well in terms of who you are, what's your personality type, and have you thought about that? The impact that might be having on you. I'm going to give you a little bit of theory now. This is all to do with our psychological needs, and it's a theory by Deggy and Ryan back in 2000, and it's quite interesting when it comes to stress. If we want to become healthy, happy, and more engaged, Deggy and Ryan talked about the ABC of autonomy, belonging, and competence. And they basically said that from a psychological perspective, we all need to have some form of control in our lives, and particularly with regard to our behaviors and how we manage our lives in terms of outcomes or the outcomes that we want to achieve. They also said that there is a need for us around belonging. In other words, to love and to be loved, to feel part of the group. You'll hear an awful lot of communication now in this crisis around we're in it together. And there's a reason why that message is sent out, and it ties in quite nicely to what this theory is saying. The third is competence, and this need for us to want to play to our strengths, to show off our strengths, but also this need for us to develop new skills, new learning. Now, that's quite interesting in times of crisis, and how it relates to stress, because one of the things that we do know is that, particularly from a business perspective, that when things go wrong, or even worse, when we end up in crisis situations, autonomy can show itself from an owner's perspective or a leader's perspective of what we call this threat rigidity response. And this is this natural response whereby we want to micromanage, to take control, to pull things close to ourselves. And if we think about how that may impact on our team or the people that we work with, well, that goes against what Decky and Ryan are saying. That goes against how we will want or perceive our need for autonomy. Because if our owner or our manager is micromanaging us, that's going to put a block or some issues around autonomy. If we think about belonging and what's happening now with regard to perhaps our need to have to work from home, or the fact that we may not be working at all, perhaps we've been furloughed, well, our sense of connection and our sense of belonging is certainly going to be impacted. So, people feeling connected through strong communication, through regular communication, even through creative communication, will help people to feel connected, less vulnerable, um, and involved. And I suppose if you're out there and you're a leader or a business owner, whatever way you want to define yourself, one thing that we may want to consider would be, how can you actually show your human side to your own people by perhaps talking about your own vulnerabilities, and giving them insight into how you're coping with the challenges that are currently out there. And the final one is competence. And when we talk about showing off our strengths and showing off our new skills, you're seeing a lot of urgency out there at the moment. And urgency usually means that we task on convenience. And what we mean by that is firefighting. So when we're firefighting, it can be that sometimes we're not thinking about stretch or challenge or playing to our strengths. It's just a case of getting done what needs done. So it's worth thinking about that from the point of view of taking a step back and thinking about what way are we working and how are we working to people's strengths? And also, what about the new skills that perhaps are going to be needed as a result of this crisis? And that those skills that could be developed now with a view to the future needs of your business. Just some thoughts worth thinking about. I'm going to talk now a wee bit more about emotion and what we call somatic markers. In other words, how the thoughts that you have running around your head will impact on how you feel, and how those feelings will impact on your behaviors. In other words, how people see you or perceive you. Now, there's a lot of research around positive emotion and the impact that positive emotions will have on you and on your behaviors, and therefore how other people will be impacted on the emotions and feelings that you are experiencing. And just looking at that slide there, it's quite powerful when we think about creative problem solving, for example, which is really part of how positive emotion affects us. Being open to new ideas, trying out difficult things, even taking calculated risks, but certainly seeing more options and helping us to learn more effectively. Now, let's just look at what that looks like when we talk about negative emotions. And in these times of crisis, when we will be experiencing, we have to be really clear that we will be experiencing negative emotions. How that can narrow our thinking, how that can limit our interpretation of how we see things, how that can cause reactionary behavior, and how we can be easily triggered, how it will shrink opportunities or possibilities that are there in front of us, how we can become disengaged, and probably most importantly, how these negative emotions will be remembered and will have long lasting effects. A lot of talk out there about how people are being treated in these difficult times and how these behaviors or how they're being treated will be remembered in the future. And also some thinking around how negative emotion actually reduces performance because it does impact on how we perform. It's really powerful when you think about it from that perspective. This wheel goes into that in a bit more detail and it helps you to understand the power of emotion and how emotion has such an impact on or such a relationship on how we feel and perhaps the pressure and stress that we have to endure. If we were to take these are in the blue, these are 6 areas around what we call emotional intelligence. I tend to call it emotional awareness because if you're aware of your emotion, then you can start becoming more intelligent around how you use that emotion effectively. We take any one of these areas, but let's have a look at resilience, which is on the left hand side, or what we call self management. And when on the outer circle, you'll see these words. We're going to look at self management just by way of example. When we are managing ourselves well, we can be seen as resilient. We can be seen as someone who has a good ability to bounce back from setbacks, etc. However, when we move into the inner circle in the white area, um, when things aren't going so well, when we're not coping with our emotions, when we're not perhaps bouncing back as well as we would hope, we could be seen or perceived as someone who's quite temperamental. The key to understanding emotion is to understand that we cannot be resilient all the time. It's an impossibility. We're not robots. And we will move from someone who is resilient, a good day perhaps, to someone who perhaps is temperamental because we're having a bad day or a bad moment. The key for me is about understanding and recognizing that this will happen. And when it does happen, how can I move myself back from perhaps that temperamental state back to that resilient state? Understanding, regulating our emotions, understanding that those emotions are there, and doing something about it. So we're going to move now to looking a wee bit more at how we actually deal with mental health at work, because I suppose when we talk about stress, we do tend to think about mental health in particular. And we know that mental health, there are certainly stigmas around that. It's not unfair or unprofessional to term it as a stigma. If someone walks into the room with a broken arm in plaster or in a sling, we can see that, we know that there's an issue. But what about when someone walks into the room and they're having some issues around their mental health. As I describe it, what's going on underneath the bonnet? And very often we cannot see underneath the bonnet. We may see that the car isn't running as well. We may see that the individual isn't performing as well. However, what is going on underneath the bonnet? And the business case here is very, very strong. And again, just have a look at the numbers that are involved. The term presenteeism there, which is the fourth bullet point, is just worth considering for a minute. The numbers are powerful, but presenteeism is a form of coping. It's a form of coping from the point of view of staying past or beyond the needed or required time at work because there's a feeling that we have to. Staying there because the boss is still there at 8 o'clock at night. And it's an interesting concept when we actually think about that it is actually a coping mechanism. And very often, when someone is in presenteeism by definition, they're not actually doing anything effective. So they're there in body, but are they there in mind? Are they there actually doing something effective? No, they're not. And that's why it's costing our economy so much money. So what's the impact for you as an individual on your team and on your business? That's something to consider. Where are you now? How would you position yourself and your business if that's applicable to you today? Something to think about. The benefits are pretty straightforward. The benefits of mental health, positive mental health in the workplace are what they are, particularly around self-esteem and confidence and motivation. And the reasons for promoting that in terms of benefits to employers are obviously all there for us to see as well. And I think they're quite obvious too. We are starting to get to know and understand what stress at work means to both individuals and to employers or businesses in general. So, what do we need in order for our people to stay well? Well, one thing that we want to consider, and I mentioned at the very start of our presentation today, is what we call early intervention. How can we see and spot the signs of stress and poor mental health within our colleagues or within our loved ones? Let's have a look at that. Well, first of all, we need to consider workplace triggers. So I've talked there about high pressure and high pressure environments and how sustainable is that? What about things like expectations and deadlines? How realistic are they? How fair are they? Um, what about our working culture? How long are people working? What about relationships at work? What about communication at work? What about change? How well are people supported through change? We're going through a huge change at the moment as I speak here today. What sort of supports in place? How well are people coping in terms of what sort of communication are they receiving about their job and job security? How much risk is there in their role? And what about this lone working? What about this for those people perhaps working at home? What sort of connection or communication are we ensuring that they're getting or perhaps they're not getting? And these are all things that can trigger issues or the start of issues around someone's mental health deteriorating. That lack of support, those long hours, that high pressure on a constant basis, perhaps, lack of control, unmanageable workloads, too much to do, negative relationships. All of these things can trigger. And when you add that To external triggers, again, I'll let you look at those for yourself. Social isolation and loneliness, we now know, is linked to depression. So feeling cut off, feeling isolated can result in feelings of despair and can lead to depression. So, as we think about this coronavirus situation, how much of a connection are your people receiving? So, the early warning signs that you want to be thinking about, and what action could you take around those early warning signs? Let's have a look at those. So, we've broken these down into physical, psychological, and behavioral. There's an old, I suppose, um, there's an old saying or view on stress and mental health, which is, I think probably most of us relate to it, which is based around back pain. So someone rings in sick because they have a sore back. I can remember that happening to a colleague of mine many years ago, but being very, very naive, I didn't realize or even think that there may be something else going on with that colleague. And this back pain was, when I look back at it, I look back from what was going on at that time. This was this person's way of um, dealing with not going to work or flagging up that things weren't good. They verbalized it or used it as back pain. Um, so you can see there that from a physical perspective, it shows up in many, many different ways. Um, from a psychological point of view, I think we all recognize anxiety and distress, but do we always recognize our mood change? Look at things like indecision, loss of humor, um, lapses in memory, difficulty in concentration or taking things in. All of these psychological issues are worth thinking about in terms of where even perhaps you find yourself today with um, the pressures that we're dealing with uh, in relation to this crisis. And then how's that showing up from a behavioral perspective? How's that impacting on your performance? How's that impacting on your behavior? How's that making you feel? And are you noticing anything about your behavior at the moment? I'll share with you now that I personally finding concentration a bit of an issue as I, as we as I record this today, right at a very crucial time with regard to the coronavirus situation. I am finding it hard to concentrate. I'm finding it hard to concentrate for long periods of time. I'm putting some uh, plans in place to help me deal with that. So um, I'm working in what I would describe bite-sized chunks. So doing work, giving myself a break, doing some more work. And the reason I think I'm not only struggling with that from the point of view of what's going on externally, it's also about the fact that I'm working differently. I'm not going out to my place of work. I'm working from home, and it is challenging me in many different ways. So I'm trying to put plans in place around my behaviors in order to deal with that. So we also know that broaching the subject of mental health can be difficult, and we talked a wee bit there earlier about stigma, and often people will not be confident in talking about this type of thing. So being an owner manager or a manager and making the first move to open up dialogue in this area can be very, very important. How can you actually start a conversation, and what do you need to think about when you're having these types of conversations? Well, this is what I would describe as a conversation checklist. And while you look down that checklist, I think one of the things that I would really want to emphasize would be the importance of what we call clean language. So, not being judgmental, um, being totally transparent, and being very careful about the language that we use. So, it's not about what we think is going on or what we think we saw happening. It's it's like about having a very evidence based, transparent conversation and letting that individual do the talking. So, making sure that they feel in a safe place, in a confidential place where there's no interruptions, no interference from other people. We talk in a very calm, professional way, and we try to encourage that individual to talk. Um, but it's not about anything to do with assumptions or being prescriptive in any shape or form. Now, when it comes to questions, these are the sort of questions that you might want to consider asking. There's also there some questions around what you wouldn't want to say or what you certainly would avoid saying. Again, you can have a look at those in your own time. And when we do end up in a situation where we have someone responding, it's worth considering how we would respond ourselves to disclosure of that nature. And right at the center of that, outside of reassuring the individual, um, would be developing an action plan. And for us as owners or managers, that's also about acknowledging that we may not have all the answers. So, um, signposting and seeking advice if we need to is really important, and being very open and honest about that in relation to how we move the conversation forward. We'll finish today by just thinking about ways in which we can deal with where we find ourselves today with regard to the coronavirus. Um, we spoke earlier about fight or flight, and this cortisol hormone is very pertinent at this moment in time, and it may mean that you feel that you're feeling a reduction in energy. Um, and if you are using that hormone as we are undoubtedly on a day to day basis, you may feel that you're starting to become um, a bit lethargic. Um, you might even be feeling exhausted by what's going on out there. So, some things to think about, first of all, would be uh, we've talked about physical activity, high intensity impact training, short, sharp sessions that you could do at home um, from from the comfort of your living room. And all you have to do is Google that to see some examples of things that you could be doing uh, over a very, very short period of time. And we're talking minutes that will keep your physical um, energies high, but at the same time, keep your energy in general high. Also, trying to hydrate regularly and cutting out sugar and getting regular sleep. Very, very important. Try and stay in routine. It's easy to go to bed late, get up late when we're out of routine. Try and stay in a regular routine. And I would promote mindfulness if you haven't heard of mindfulness before. It's all about focusing on the present, um, not looking too far ahead, not getting ourselves worried about what could happen in the future. And there's a nice app out there called Headspace, which can be downloaded free of charge and will allow you to practice mindfulness day to day in the comforts of your home. So, we're coming now to the end of our session, and a few things to think about in terms of what do you need to do in order to support the mental health and well-being of your people at work. What are you already doing, and perhaps what could you start to think about doing by way of improving this particular area. Um, I'll sign off by saying that if you require or would benefit from more information in this particular area, um, make contact directly with Derry City and Strabane District Council, or failing that, come directly to ourselves at Full Circle Management Solutions in Belfast, and we will be more than happy to advise and provide you with whatever information you think would be of benefit to you on at this particular time. I want to thank you for taking time to tune in and listen to our presentation today. And I want to wish you all the very best over the coming days and weeks as we come to terms with the situation we find ourselves in at this moment in time. Thank you very much now, and all the best.